We are here coming into land in Highfleet, and that looked pretty good, I think. Another happy landing. It's time for a full game commentary on Highfleet. That means we'll be looking at all the most interesting moments of my playthrough of this game, and I'll just be broadly talking about the game and my thoughts on it, my first impressions and final impressions, and how things changed as they went along, because this is a game where, at first at least, I was kind of frustrated with it, and perhaps a lot of people who play the game probably already know why that is, but I've got some unique reasons as well that I think are unique to me, which might be interesting to go over. And then later we'll be looking at a more sort of complete view of the game for how things play towards the end, and I'll try to give some design thoughts because that's what I like to do. So that's the two objectives. Let's get going. We start with restarting that landing. This is the first thing the game makes you do. It makes you do several landing minigames. A really weird way to kick off the game because this isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. I'm guessing they just wanted to give you something kind of easy to do. You can play the game without having to do this in the main game, but that's the first thing it hits you with in the tutorial. So what are we doing? We're landing rockets on pads. It reminds me of the game that I've forgotten the name of from the really old days. There was a game that was just this. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? A really old school thing to be doing in a video game. It actually does have some utility in game, and sometimes you do need to do it, so we'll talk about that as it happens. But to start with, well, I'm having a bit of difficulty. The reason is because I'm impatient. It does this thing where it like drops you from the sky and you choose when to shoot the engines to try and land on a pad. And you could just come down really slowly and do it easily, but I'm too impatient, so I was trying to fire the engines at the last possible second to get that part of the game over with, basically. So we got through that after some very hard landings. And then we progressed into some kind of plot. And I thought for one of my early game rants, I like to rant about things in these commentaries early on, like some topic that came to mind just to get it out of the way and drive people away from the video. And I decided to rant not about the game itself, but about the plot. I really like the plot of Highfleet, or like the setting, because I'm like a doomer in my futuristic predictions. Like Highfleet's vision of the future is like what I think is much more likely to happen for a human future. I'm more of a Highfleet than a Star Trek sort of future prediction guy, because this is more like it to me, a future where there are no longer resources, but like some semblance of old technology is still around, and basically people are just fighting over it, and there's not that much else going on the planet. But there's one massive thing about the plot, an enormous thing about the plot, that I hated so much that overall I would say I dislike the plot. So there's some nice contradictory statements to make. I'll get into that in a second. Here's where the main game takes place. On this UI, we are sort of inside a ship looking at a top-down view of where the ship is on a map, that sort of thing. And you'll immediately note the UI is super cool. This is a really interesting thing to me because it does actually make the UI harder to use, but it is also better in my opinion. I'm like a UI nerd, if you don't know, so I always like to look at UIs and think about how easy they are to use and how likely it is that somebody just looking at it would know what's going on, all sorts of things. I'm the sort of person that in the past would have caused cool UIs like this to stop existing. I'm like the guy that would be brought in as a consultant to delete your cool UI and make a boring UI. That's me, but I think Highfleet has a great UI. I did find it hard to use. I think it is actually making the game more difficult just through its UI, and that's sort of the faux pas that companies try to avoid. But it's so immersive, it fits in so well with the vibe of the game. It's worth any sacrifices, I think, to have the UI just be like all this stuff in your face and nobody's going to know what's going on. Even towards the end of the game, I didn't fully understand like what the buttons on the UI were, or even what things on the UI were supposed to be interactable buttons. But it's super cool, and I'm just going to brush over all of my own criticisms and say, this is good. We'll look at a few specifics later on, of course. What's actually happening? We're flying from one town to another on this basic map, and that's the core thing you do in the game, is travel from town to town on a map. We'll get more into this later. We are only in the tutorial campaign here, which is a very simplistic version of this. But the thing that got me into playing Highfleet, the thing that I saw somebody else playing and thought, well, that looks interesting, is the combat. And that's what happens when you reach a town. You fight the town garrison before you're allowed to land. There are some plot reasons why you always have to fight people to land. They don't matter for now. Let's look at the combat. It's extremely old school with an extremely new school design. This, like the UI, is a case where It's sort of super stylish to the game's detriment, and the only design question from a loser like me is the trade-off worth it? Like, it's so good looking, it's so good feeling, it's so immersive, the sound is out of control good, but it does make the game harder to play to be like this. There's a bit less gameplay than like a normal game would have in a scenario like this, because a lot of the time you can't see lots of the screen, as you can see here. The thing you're controlling is kind of small and hard to look at, especially because it's dark and raining in this scene. And while that looks great and the fire looks great, the smoke looks great, when you're playing, you're not necessarily looking at that. You're not sort of thinking about how good it looks. You're thinking about the gameplay side of things. And that stuff kind of got in the way. That's the vague point I want to make. I often found that I wasn't able to enjoy being immersed in the game so much because of just how good it looks. It's like blocking your view of things, and like you're sort of looking at this through like a camera that's away from the ship you're in, which I guess is sort of an immersion thing, you could argue. Like, you're supposed to be in the ship, but you're also looking at it through like a camera with water on the lens that's somewhere else looking at the fight. And that makes it harder to control. We'll come back to fights, because of course there's going to be many in this game. But that was my first impression, that it was kind of like so stylish that it was actually a problem. We'll see if that holds up. Here's another thing that I thought was going to be a bigger deal in the game. You can customize your little ships with different parts. There are all sorts of restrictions on doing this in the game that mean, in practice, you're not really going to be customizing your ships very much. For the most part, the ship customization menu is just used to repair ships that have been damaged in combat. It does have a system where parts of the ships can be blown off in combat, which is extra good, love to see it. But there is a sort of missed potential that I expected to see after it started introducing these mechanics where you could customize the ships on the fly and make them do different things. Not really. And to some extent that's a balancing choice. It just doesn't really let you buy the parts. We'll have to get into that as we go through the main game. Now we're going into a different combat, where it's telling me about firing missiles at things. This is something that actually probably won't come up very much in this game, because I found firing missiles to be something that is like a rare treat. Perhaps that's a shame, because it's a cool thing to do. Again, we'll have to talk about that as we go through. Basically, in this fight, we take out two opponents immediately, and on the topic of there being two opponents, another thing that took me by surprise, that somehow I didn't really realize from watching gameplay videos of this, is that you only control one ship. You are a fleet, as implied in the title of the game, but for whatever reason, in combat, you can only deploy one ship at a time, and you can choose to retreat your ship from combat to pull out the next one, or the next one will show up if you die, but you really shouldn't be dying, because of how difficult the game is. You need to avoid dying, basically. That was a cool kill where the enemy's anti-aircraft missile coming from the ground hit one of their own flyers. Well, as implied by what I just said, there are multiple enemies on the map, so it is a one versus many fight. All the fights are supposed to be unfair, and you just have to deal with that. I think this makes the game very, I'm not sure what the correct word is, repulsive, I guess, although that gives the wrong impression. Like, a new player playing this will definitely fail. Like, it's too hard for somebody to just pick this up and start playing it. The mechanics, the controls are too, like, unique to this game. And I can totally imagine people having a bad time with this as a result. Like, I'm the sort of person that's played these sort of side-on, like, Japanese action shooter games a lot, so it kind of came easily to me, the fact that it's really hard to aim and kind of hard to pilot your ships, but I could totally see somebody just having an abysmal time with this because it's too difficult. And we'll talk about difficulty later, because from other things I've seen, other people I've seen describing the game is quote-unquote too hard. Like, most people seem to fail with this game. And that's one of these things where people will come to like it because it's hard, but I always think that's like a mistake to go down that path, to think, yes, it was the hardness that I liked about the game. I think you're missing that you still would have liked it more if you'd been able to learn it and come up to the mastery of the game via a different path. This is a very abstract argument that I like to make about games in general. Let's not make it here. What's happening? We've come to a new place, and there's some guy we have to talk to. Occasionally in this game, very occasionally in my experience, you have to do these little text challenges where you talk to somebody and have to say the right things. There's a system where your crew has like a worldview, and you have a set of allies in your fleet. who like you a certain amount based on what you say when occasionally the game will ask you to do these little text challenges. This is significantly less important than I thought it was going to be, so I was taking it very seriously at first and sort of trying to think about what to actually do. It didn't matter so much. As far as I can tell, and looking back on it, there is a random element to it where you're not really supposed to know what to do. And that dilutes the importance as well. Essentially, as we see on the left there, we've discovered one of this guy's character traits. Each guy you talk to in the talking challenges has various traits that determine what lines you should say to them to make them like you. But at first you can't see their traits, so it's trial and error. Like, you say something, and then based on their reaction you'll determine some of their traits and you'll know what to say next. So to quote-unquote win, you just kind of have to get lucky and say something that they actually like immediately and just discover that they liked that thing. And what you say also changes this worldview system. You saw me looking at it very briefly there. It doesn't really matter, I don't think. We'll see much later a case where I actually needed to know what it was and use it for something. It's probably not important enough that you need to worry about it very much, in my own opinion. So we're going to try and talk to this guy and just sort of guess what he likes. You're only allowed to say 5 things, just like in real life. So if you say the wrong thing, you're in trouble. We just said the wrong thing, we're in trouble. So the like bar is at -1. This guy does not like us, we said the wrong thing. And the goal is to make them like you enough so that they'll join you. And if you get that, if you get a person to join you, you get an ally in your ally list, which will do something. We'll talk about that way later, because I didn't use it for most of the campaign, like the ally features. But perhaps more importantly, you get their ship if you convince them to join you. So it's a way to get a free extra ship in your fleet. That could be a bad thing, it could be a ship you don't want, but you could sell it or something. Well, this conversation is going very badly because we picked the wrong things. And we do not recruit this guy. I don't know if this matters because we're in the tutorial campaign, which is like a mini section of the campaign that's separate from the real one. I don't know if you even keep that guy into the real campaign if you do succeed in the tutorial. Well, we've shot ourselves in the foot from the beginning, and I think that was just random chance, like whether that would have worked or not for me. So it's a shame. Now with that over, I thought I would quickly actually explain the thing about the lore and the setting that I don't like. So leaving aside all aspects of game design, something that annoyed me or unimmersed me heavily was, how to put it, rockets. I don't like rockets for many reasons. So you might be asking, you're playing Highfleet, a game about rockets, and that you're complaining that you don't like rockets and that's why you don't like the setting. Yes. Any questions? It's something that conflicts with what I said earlier, where I'm like, Highfleet is me, a doomer's vision of the future. But I'm also a physics loser, and that means I cannot accept the idea of rockets being in wide use instead, as the main kind of vehicle. Because if you're in a sort of low resource, chaotic future world, one of the main things you don't want to do is use rockets. You also probably don't want to do what I've done here. In the previous town, it gave you the chance to customize your ships, so I put a fuel tank on top of all of them. Not necessarily a good idea, because you might get shot at the top of your ship. And also in this fight, it introduces the incendiary system, where certain ammunition types that the enemy use will set you on fire. And this is just the worst thing about the game mechanically to me, the being on fire system. I hated this passionately every time it happened. You can avoid it, but it's so expensive to avoid being on fire. Never mind, I don't want to rant about that right now, because I want to rant about something far more stupid than that. I want to rant about rocket ships. You know, one of the main reasons you wouldn't want to use rocket ships in a military setting is that they're extremely weak. And this does actually come into the game, in that the game realistically simulates how rockets fly. So for example, if you take a hit on your engines, your handling can be obliterated and you might just crash land. This is the sort of thing that sort of totally unimmersed me, because it's like, this wouldn't have happened. I can see everything about this world actually happening in real life, apart from the rockets part. These vehicles wouldn't come to be the main thing that militaries use, because they have an extremely short flight range, they're weak against everything, small arms fire from the ground can take out a large rocket if it does anything to slightly impact the angle of a rocket nozzle cone, or just puts a hole in it or something. A tiny little hole can absolutely obliterate the thrust distribution pattern and cause the ship to start just spinning in the air or something like that. And yes, that sort of happens in the game sometimes, but nowhere near the extent this would happen in real life. And what I kept thinking is, why does it have to be rockets? Like, I wish it was about gigantic planes or gigantic airships, or even better, the thing I really wanted from Highfleet was for it to be top-down and be about gigantic ground vehicles, because that fits into the vibe and mechanics of the game so well, and would be mechanically identical in terms of the gameplay. I'm just like, does it have to be rockets? Can we have some consideration for the physics losers out there who can't deal with the concept that a military would mainly deploy weird rocket ships? They're not even like helicopters. These things are so much more technologically advanced than like what it would need to be to work effectively in this setting. And they're so much worse and more expensive. What world caused this to happen? Is the world completely overflowing with rocket fuel but doesn't have anything else for some reason? Like, we can't synthesize regular combustion engine fuel. We can only get rocket fuel, which is much harder, and you use much more of it to do anything anytime you fly a vehicle of this type. I don't know. Back at it again. I hated that so much. It's sort of hard to explain how much I disliked it, because it sort of seems like a petty thing. Like, can't you just accept that it's rockets because it's cool? Rule of cool. No, I can't. But the reason I can't accept it is because I liked everything else so much. Like, I don't need to apply the rule of cool to anything else, in my opinion, because it's spot on. And this is spot off, and it's a big spot off that covers everything else. The spot is too big. And other ways of using words to describe things. So, long story short, rockets, no. Highfleet 2, make it about vehicles, make it about ships, make it about gigantic planes. If you added wings to these rocket ships, they would be 10,000 times better. Their performance characteristics would be greatly enhanced, they would be much less weak in combat. Overall, I'm still mad. You know what? One reason I'm mad about the ships being weak in combat is what you see here. I'm getting absolutely obliterated in combat, and this is because of this incendiary thing. We're being set on fire instantly the second we enter combat. And once you're on fire, you have the opportunity to press B on the keyboard to put the fire out. This was hard to remember to do for me at first, just because there's so much stuff going on. And also, you can only do it once. Like, you have a number of fire extinguishers on your ship, and once you've used them, you can't put them out anymore. But of course, the enemy has more than like 3 incendiary bullets to fire at you, so probably you'll be on fire more than you're not on fire. That's going to be a problem. It's a huge problem in this fight, combined with the fact we're under anti-aircraft missile fire, and if your ships have been damaged to the point that they're not very maneuverable anymore, you have very little chance of dodging a missile being fired at you, because they do home in on you. You just sort of have to juke around and try not to get hit by them. So, we're having a difficult time. It's also kind of dark and hard to see what's going on. Another thing to mention is that the game has some quite decent physics when it comes to shooting. So the physics nerd is now going to come back around again and say something good about the physics. When you fire, your shots carry the momentum that your ship has, and this is realistic. So like, if your ship is dropping down as you shoot, the bullets you fire will take on a downward arcing trajectory more so than gravity would allow. And you have to take that into account, which means aiming is incredibly difficult, combined with the fact that you don't really have like sights. Like, you don't aim, you kind of guess where your shots are going to go. This is part of the reason I think the game is so difficult, and will be difficult especially for anybody just attempting to play it. Like, right here, I'm one of the things on the screen here getting absolutely obliterated behind the smoke. You're just getting shot by so many things simultaneously. What you're supposed to do is juke around and dodge everything. And there's a couple of things that it took me a while to work out, like, you could use to help you out with this. One is that the enemy ships have this like red line that flashes out of them, indicating where they're going to fire next, and you get like 1 second to dodge. So if you pay attention to that, you can be much more effective at dodging. I wasn't really looking at that at first, because I was trying to look for like me on the screen. Like, I was trying to look at the aiming arrow where it tells you what direction your guns are facing, and doing like the in-your-head physics calculations required to guess which direction to fire in to hit the enemy, those sorts of things. So I wasn't really looking at the enemy. It also flashes up with an icon over the enemy to tell you what kind of ammunition they're loading next, and occasionally that matters as well. And of course, with all these things to think about, like where to aim, how to fly, when to use the afterburners because your engines overheat, and things like that, it's difficult to also think like, there's a missile coming at me, especially because the missile warning beep and the you're on fire beep are both going off simultaneously all the time. It's very difficult to wrap your head around Highfleet just in the beginning, and we're still in the tutorial here. I'm having such a hard time, and I guess that's my first impression of the game. It is just hard, and I would say it's too hard. It's obviously deliberately like this. You're supposed to just have a nightmare, and based on people's discussions of the game, people seem to indicate that they just fail really hard until they succeed. And I was thinking about this morning for a different reason, looking at some random old roguelikes, thinking there are people who really like it when a game is just so hard and you just have to keep failing to succeed. But I'm sort of a real modern minded gamer. I'm a sort of gamer in the real world. A gamer in the wild might not have very much time in their life to actually play this game. So the thing that's good about the game needs to be in your face and front and center, in my opinion. And I actually don't think you have to sacrifice anything to do that, and you can still provide the hardcore experience using the dirty word, modes. This game does have some difficulty modes, we'll discuss them later. They're not very significant in my opinion, and probably the easiest thing to say for how I would change the new player experience would be something just remove one layer of complexity for new players. For example, on easy mode or in the tutorial, you don't get fired at from the ground with anti-aircraft missiles or something like that. There's one fewer thing to think about so that you can get used to thinking about something else first. It's harder to put the pieces together when they're all being thrown in your face and they're on fire so violently. It's hard to get into the game and appreciate what's good about it because it's just too much of it at once. And the classic solution is difficulty curves and such. You might just have a stage where you just have to pilot the ship just to get used to piloting the ship, and then a stage where you just have to aim the guns to get used to that. But because even from the beginning in the tutorial you're doing everything, what we're seeing here is an example of end game combat basically. It's like this for the entire game. It's hard to appreciate it because it technically is good. Looking back on it from the end, it is cool. There is stuff you can do in scenarios like this to get around it and have fun. But you, quote unquote you, the person who doesn't know how to do that, the theoretical new player, can't get that fun just because it's thrown too violently at you and you won't see it. There's too much to process here on the screen, in my own opinion anyway. And you just take something away, just make it so the enemies don't fire at you for one stage, make it so there's no anti-aircraft missiles. The same logic will apply on the campaign map, where there are similar campaign mechanics where I would just say remove a couple of them for the start of the campaign or something, so that it's easier for people to learn the existing ones. There's this game dev rule that's thrown about sometimes, which is that you always overestimate how good your players are at your game. You overestimate how much information there is, I suppose. That's the real lesson. Your players know less than you could possibly imagine about how to play your game. They won't understand even things that you as the developer will think are really obvious and easy. People will still not get it because you just can't imagine what it's like to not know how to play your game because you're in a completely different headspace. You completely forget everything. And perhaps Highfleet is suffering from that to some extent. The beginning is super cool. They're trying to make it super cool and explosive and violent and it's flashy. I liked it, but it was not fun to play it, that's for sure. I was just having a miserable time trying to get through this battle. I did get through it a couple of times, but you might have seen you get the chance to just do a battle again if it goes badly. So I was succeeding in such a way that all my ships were in terrible condition. We might have lost some ships, we lost tons of crew. And yes, in the real game, you would actually want to restart a battle if that happened. So it's not a case where I should have just kept going and accepted my terrible result. In this game, you should not accept terrible results because it's a positive feedback loop game. We'll get into that. The most important place to do well in the game is the very beginning. And this restart battle feature is your salve, your opportunity to not just start the game again and not just have this be a roguelike or something. Although I just said the dirty word roguelike, this game does have a couple of roguelike-ish elements that really took me by surprise and I didn't necessarily appreciate. We'll come back to that later. The thing to say though is that I was enjoying the combat, even though it's going absolutely terribly. I like aiming using intuition. I found that a satisfying way to aim. I wouldn't recommend doing this. If I was making a game, I would never dare have it be this hard to aim at enemies. I would have the line extending out from your ship be really long to represent the fact that your gunners have sights or something like that. Because there's no reason for it to be this hard, really. I enjoyed doing it like this, kind of as a challenge, because for whatever reason my mind gelled with being able to aim like this. but I think it's dumb still. So that's a sort of objective versus subjective criticism. I liked it, but I would recommend against anyone else doing this. I think it's dumb. I think it would be nice, of course, to simply have the option of having it like that if you wanted. The game would probably be more fun for most players if you hadn't done it like that. I'm saying you. I'm presuming that you, watching this video, were responsible for all of the design decisions in Highfleet, which you probably were. I think, if I remember correctly, this game was made by like 2 people, so it's one of these games where it's like an amazing achievement for such a small dev team who presumably didn't have much money. I think it might have been a Kickstarter game or something, so maybe they actually did have loads of money. It certainly looks good enough to represent a game that would have had loads of money behind it, so that's something. I eventually got through one of the tutorial fights there, and, well, we progress on towards the main game, with morale probably very low at this stage for how badly it's going, and we're not even into the main game. Still too impatient to properly land the ships, so we're just completely planting the ships into the ground. Luckily, like with combat, it just tells you to do it again if it goes badly, so you can just keep doing it until it works. It's very forgiving and generous in that way, a sort of strange spirit, in that the game is normally super unforgiving, but it's really forgiving about letting you start again. And that's necessary, basically. If they hadn't done that, this game would be disastrously difficult, I think. It would be extremely old school to not do that. There would be arguments in favor of not letting the player start again and forcing Iron Man, and just saying if you make one mistake, start the campaign again. You know, it doesn't matter if it took you 10 hours to get this far, do those 10 hours again, and do it better this time. But while some games do that, the game has to be extremely mechanically satisfying to justify that, in my opinion. Highfleet probably doesn't quite have that, but it is very mechanically satisfying. I like the combat. I probably wouldn't play the campaign twice or something like that, and you probably are supposed to want to. We'll come back to that and why I think that in a bit. After somehow bumbling our way to victory, we make it to the next part of the tutorial, the radio tutorial. There's this radio system in the game where you do this mini-game sometimes to decode radio transmissions, and the one negative thing I'd seen before playing the game was people complaining about this mechanic. And I can see why. We'll probably get into that later. I am also an anti-the radio mechanics guy, but I have some constructive criticism at least. I think it could be rescued quite easily. For now, it's just telling you that you can turn some knobs to decode radio transmissions, and that's really all there is to it. It's a very basic mechanic, but it comes up a surprising amount. I think people probably forget how much of the game is the radio minigame. It comes up all the time, and it doesn't necessarily contribute very much to what's happening in the game. It depends, really. The idea is you might get some intel that you'd use to affect your decision making. It's just in practice, you don't always or rarely get useful intel, and it always comes at a cost. You always have to stop doing something else to do that. So we'll come back to me ranting about that once it becomes a problem for me. After that, you see me here poking about in the ship creator thing, which is back out on the main menu. You can go into a little ship creating mode where you can just build ships and not really do anything in particular with them. I think the reason I was back out here is that I was actually disappointed with what I saw in the tutorial because I wasn't getting the battles that I'd seen on YouTube or something, or in some random clips somewhere that had inspired me to check this game out. So I thought maybe the shipbuilding stuff would be cool. It doesn't really play into the game very much. So there is this shipbuilding menu, and you can use it to affect the game, but not very much, and it's very hard to change the designs of your ships while you're in the game. So it's basically the opposite of something like Ovorian, which I really liked recently, where you could change your ships on the fly and do all sorts of creative things with it. That I thought was fun. We'll see what I mean, hopefully, as we go along. Eventually, I'm back in the tutorial, probably on another day or something like that, once my morale had been restored, and we're doing the strike group tutorial. This strike group thing isn't necessarily just about strike groups. Essentially, you can split your fleet into more than one fleet, and the intended use for this is to make a fast fleet and a slow fleet, and the fast one will go forward and do your offensive stuff as you approach enemy locations, and then the slow one will meander in later. The idea is the enemy have a sort of detection time where it takes them a while to work out what you're doing. So if you attack and kill them before they work out what you're doing, they won't radio your position to other enemies who will come looking for you. So you need to have a few fast ships to do that. You can just use it to have more than one fleet all the time. It's fully supported. Like once a strike group is split off, it's its own fleet with all of the same mechanics as the regular one. So that's pretty good. A nice contrast to Star Sector, which is a game that I think is sorely missing this exact mechanic. It was good to see it here. It doesn't come in that useful in this game, but we will use it. Well, basically, we use it a little bit for every attack, just to make the attack with the faster part of the fleet. But having, like, 2 independent fleets isn't that useful, I don't think anyway. But we will see me doing that later on. Anyway, we move in. And well, the bad news is that because we've got through the menu part of the tutorial, the next part of the tutorial is gonna have to be doing another fight. So it's time for some more learning on the job, as it were, just restarting the fight over and over until things go well. Somehow it's still nighttime, it's still raining. It didn't look like it was on the campaign map. We can still barely see what's going on. And as you might have seen there, one of the see what's going on base mechanics is also that the screen goes dark now and again. It goes dark when you accelerate. You can press shift to accelerate a bit faster for a very short time before your engines catch on fire, which is basically all the time as usual. And when you do that, the screen fades to black slightly, and for ages I was like, why is it doing that? Is that a glitch? Because one of the game's aesthetics is that it has glitches. You might notice like your targeting reticule isn't always pointing the same direction, it moves around, sometimes there's 2 of them, things like that, to represent that your targeting systems on your ship are being damaged. So a very cool way of implementing that, and I thought the fade to black thing was supposed to be that as well. It's actually supposed to be that when you accelerate, everybody on the ship is falling unconscious from the G-forces. I think that's what they're doing with that. I didn't realize until way later in the campaign that might be what they're doing. Well, all I'll say is I found it was something that made it harder to learn the game, even harder to learn the game, because I was already struggling with just literally seeing myself on the screen, with the screen fading to black all the time as you try to dodge enemy attacks. Makes it extra hard to dodge them if you're sort of closing your eyes and then dodging them. Well anyway, after hacking my way through that fight, we move on to the final battle of the tutorial. We have nearly achieved something great in Highfleet. Can I get through the tutorial fight? Well, this is actually a pretty difficult fight. 2 anti-air missile launchers that I remember looking it up eventually, I think they have infinite ammo, whereas anti-air missiles fired from other ships will run out, so you can dodge them for ages and they will eventually stop doing it, but the ones on the ground won't. So you just have to spend the entire fight dodging missiles, and dodging, well, everything else. Because it means the usual unit limit, where the enemy will only attack you with 3 of their ships at a time, is overridden when there are ground units because they don't count. So here we're being attacked by 5 units at a time, including 2 that we can't see off screen. And, well, we're having a difficult time. It's one of these things where your performance in combat switches a lot between things going really well and things going badly, because the moment you get hit by something, things will start going badly, because being hit disables engines, it messes up your maneuverability, and probably the slight pause, or the sort of quote-unquote stun you get from being hit, where your ship can't maneuver because it's extremely on fire for a second or 2, will also cause you to be hit by something else, because so many things are flying at you all the time. There's an example of some actual dodging happening and the screen darkening at the same time. We did it, we dodged 2 missiles, there are only 500,000 more to dodge, and we might get through this, and here come 3 volleys of gunfire as well, and with that our ship is now on fire, plummeting towards the ground. Things aren't looking too good. One tactical thing that I was getting wrong for a long time and eventually realized I was getting wrong is positioning, because I was trying to be big-brained. I'm thinking yeah, aerial combat, you need energy advantage in air combat theory. That means you need to be going faster than the enemy, or you need to be higher than them. So I spent a lot of time trying to get to the top of the screen where there's an invisible wall. And this isn't really the right idea in Highfleet, because almost every ship is weak on its underside, so you want to be below the enemy firing up at them ideally, and I just sort of had the wrong idea about that. At this early stage in the game, I'm of course not thinking about enemy armor placement or anything like that, because that's way too advanced. I'm thinking, is there any way for me to not get hit 500,000 times within the first 2 seconds of combat? And so far, the answer is no. It can be done in certain circumstances and in certain ways, but I was having an extremely difficult time. It's one of these things where this happened so long ago to me that I forget how much I liked it. I was saying earlier, I enjoy the combat, because my vague memory is that I do enjoy the combat of Highfleet, but I'm pretty sure I was having a terrible time in the tutorial, and well, right here's footage of me not doing anything, which I present as evidence of me having a terrible time. We lost that fight again, I just sat there, couldn't be bothered to click retry. I was probably thinking like, are you supposed to win this? Is this the tutorial? Like, this is way too hard, like I just can't get through this. I can't even imagine defeating like 1 or 2 of these enemies. So I sat there for a while, I probably rage quit and came back another time. I think the reason I would have come back after like not having a good time is that there's so much potential here. Like I could feel the fun in the combat system, I just wasn't having it. I could sort of tell it was there. Like I liked the effects, I liked controlling the ships, I just didn't like that I spent a lot of the time not being able to control the ship because I was on fire or the engines were hit or something like that all the time. Well, I did have one more idea, and this did essentially work things out in the end. There's actually a button on the UI that says ask for help, and it flashes sometimes as well. So you can get the allies you collect in the campaign to do special things for you, which are, well, pretty special. So I asked the admiral who's with us to give me some ships, and he just pulled some more ships out of his inventory. So now, as we go into the final battle once again, we have more ships in our fleet. Since, of course, we can only bring 1 ship into battle at a time, what that means in practice is that we have more quote-unquote lives, like we have more ships to sacrifice to try and get through this battle and see what happens afterwards. But it's still going to be difficult for us. The one thing I want to note, again, is look at how good everything looks. That aircraft carrier crashing down through the battle towards the ground, leaving that smoke trail, and just all of the effects and all of the sounds as well. It really is like one-of-a-kind good. It's too good, and that's perhaps again one of the reasons why I felt like pushing through the fact that I probably was having a miserable time here. What I actually wonder is what percentage of the people who like Highfleet now also didn't like it at first because of things like this, because of inaccessibility effectively. And then the other big question is, what percentage of people who would like Highfleet, if they could get past this, don't get to play it? Like, to what extent is the game's popularity diminished because of this? And on the flip side, to what extent is it sort of increased by the fact there's a legendary status attached to games that are very hard to play and very hard to succeed in, and you can't really do anything about that? Obviously the classic example would be Dark Souls, where because people found it very difficult to get into it, it gained that legendary status as like a hard game. But as I actually argued in my most recent video as well, it's not actually that hard. It's easier than other games in its genre. It's just that it's kind of weird and it doesn't explain itself very well, and it doesn't have that much of a sort of on-ramp to get used to playing it before it asks you to do difficult things. And Highfleet is a much more extreme example of that, I would argue. I got pretty far in Dark Souls the first time I played it back in the good old days, on mouse and keyboard as well, if you'll believe that. But in Highfleet, well, I'm not getting through this tutorial. We're not getting out of this undead asylum anytime soon. Well, the actual solution is shown here. One of the ships that guy gave me out of his inventory was just way better than all of the others. So eventually, once that one came up, I was able to win with extreme casualties, as reported here. There's a sort of dynamic between small, dodgy ships and fast, powerful ships, which we'll look into more. But eventually, I've got to the cutscene at the end of the tutorial. We've achieved something brilliant in Highfleet, and I felt like a decent amount of the players probably wouldn't bother to push through to the extent that I did there. That's something where it's impossible to know what percentage of the player base it would be. It's just that the ideal percentage is 0. So it's probably not 0, and that's the problem. So we're just going to gesture at that as being an issue. The game's tutorial is too hard. It's actually genuinely harder than the main game, because we're about to go on and see some success in the main game, which begins here. You start off the main campaign choosing what ships you're going to take with you, and it gives you a budget to pick what you want. And when I saw this menu, I was hit. My radar was going off, so to speak, because I have this radar that detects when I'm about to be secretly playing a roguelike, or to be more specific, secretly playing a game where it's not like a continuous experience, so you might be expected to start again. Something more like Faster Than Light comes to mind when comparing to Highfleet, where it has a couple of roguelike-like influences in that it's not necessarily supposed to be easy enough that you can go through it in one playthrough. You probably have to start the game again, and you probably have to repeat some of the content again in order to complete it. You're intended to repeat the early game multiple times. At least that's the impression I get from Highfleet, and it's sort of a staple of that vague genre, so maybe the influence is there. And seeing this menu kind of tipped me off that that's where it was going. I only confirmed this much later, but at this stage I remember thinking, or worrying actually, that it was going to be like that, because it only ever needs to show you a menu like this if it's going to make you start the game a lot of times. Like, it gives you so many options. It's like you wouldn't need to put this in the game if you weren't expecting the player to experiment with different builds or something like that and play the game lots of times. So I just had the wrong idea. Again, if you don't know, I extremely rarely read like the descriptions of games or even look at their genre, because I like to be extremely pure when I do my commentaries. I try to avoid looking at any reviews, any walkthroughs, any information whatsoever, and try to just put up precisely what the game in front of me is putting down and nothing else, to allow my commentary to be as annoying as possible. And sometimes that might actually lead to some unique insights coming through. Most of the time, it's me just being like, what the? This game has genre conventions? Or like, what the? This game has rockets in it? I'm outraged that this rocket game has rockets in it. Well, maybe those comments are valuable in some way. Looks like I'm going to have to make a decision. Is there any hope of me making the correct decision? Probably not here, and that's where the experimentation, or realistically in a game like this, just looking at walkthroughs or getting community advice on how to do it, is supposed to come in. Most likely, the developers don't think they've given you enough information to sort of just go through this part of the game that is put in front of you correctly. They probably expect you to end up back here another time to try again. So there's sort of two player approaches to a situation like this, where the game isn't onboarding enough to play it correctly the first time around. There's the get good crowd, which might involve just playing the game a lot of times, like just trying to get through it by sheer experience, which is the old-fashioned way of doing things. Then there's the everyone else crowd, I guess, where they'll probably just use a walkthrough. And it's one of these cases where a lot of the time people, well, not a lot of the time, sometimes people will advocate against games being hard and not onboarding players very well, because there's some sort of value in allowing people to learn things for themselves and hack through the difficulty for themselves. It's just that in reality, people don't do that. They will just go to walkthroughs, they just look stuff up on wikis, like if the game doesn't tell them the information that they thought they needed. Which, in effect, is the same thing the developers could have been doing by just telling you that information in the game. So I often find there's a sort of vague weakness in the get good argument, which comes from the fact that most people actually don't want to, and even a massive proportion, I imagine, of the people like playing a difficult game who just complain about people complaining about the game being difficult, themselves probably did use walkthroughs or wikis or Reddit or something to get external information. And perhaps by get good, what they literally mean is look at the walkthrough, because in practice that is how you're going to get good unless you have a lot of free time and a lot of patience, I guess. It's just sort of an old school philosophy that I'm kind of into. I kind of like forcing your way through a game by getting good at it. It reminds me of how I used to play games a long time ago, like as a kid, because you had no choice and because it was fun and because you'd sort of show off to some extent, like how good you can, or how quickly you can get good at a game. So I'm quite sympathetic to that idea. It's just that I don't like it being forced upon me, or more broadly forced upon people. Like, in principle I'm against it, even if I might be into it sometimes personally. I'm not sure why I'm on this rant right now. Does what I'm saying here apply to Highfleet? I think to some extent it probably does. I broadly think Highfleet would be better if it was easier, and people will argue against that, and what I just said is supposed to be some kind of counter-argument to the argument that is countering me. Back at it again with the most schizophrenic game commentary you'll ever find. I've got all the arguments, I've also got all the arguments against myself, and I've got the arguments against those arguments. So I'm having a great time. You guys don't need to be here. I'm entertaining myself right here. I've had all the discussions I need about Highfleet so far. Well, anyway, the actual point of all this footage is that I went for easy difficulty, and obviously that's influenced by my experience with the tutorial. I found it to be too difficult, so I thought I'll play the campaign on easy and see what changes. The actual biggest change that tipped me over to going for easy is that on easy difficulty you can save the game, which is a pretty big advantage to gain, not just in terms of like you could use it to save scum. We're not going to do that because I'm too honourable or something. Like, I always just play Iron Man anyway. The reason I want to be able to save the game is so that I can leave my PC whenever I want. Like, that's the actual reason. I'm a very convenience-focused gamer who has a lot of real-world concerns when it comes to gaming. I want to be able to walk away at any moment, so the games where you can just save whenever you want are ideal. So with the game offering that to me as an optional mechanic, I basically had to take it so that I can go and cook dinner or something at the time when I need to go and cook dinner. Well, that's just how it is ruling a fleet. Sometimes you're too busy to rule the fleet. I don't have time for this battle, guys. Put it aside. Let's go make some spaghetti bolognese. The men will appreciate it, I'm sure. So we are finally, this deep into the commentary, actually starting the game, and it's explaining what the game is supposed to be like. And when I saw this map, this is where the faster than light comparison came in again. What I was wondering is this map randomly generated? It doesn't look very handmade, and I think it is. So that's another signal pulsing on the roguelike detector. It's got procedural generation, so that's there to support playing the game multiple times and having things be slightly different every time. The big sacrifice being that there isn't one superior playthrough, there are just lots of inferior playthroughs that are together supposed to be superior. And that might take place, that might work out. A matter of taste to some extent. It's just explaining all the ways you're going to die, basically. We'll find them ourselves as we go on, so let's get into things here. The goal of the campaign is to get to the top of the map, where Kiva is, and capture the nuclear reactor there. There will be tons of enemy fleets looking for you to try and stop you, and almost every settlement on the map is hostile to you, because in the lore, there's like a big civil war going on in this empire that we're part of, and we're trying to restore the official order of the official empire. But if you're looking at the cutscene earlier, it was saying the official empire's in a bit of a state, has been nuked to some extent, and it might just be that we're the only remaining fleet of this official empire, and everybody's going their own way at this stage. Can we hold it together? I guess. The lore doesn't really play into things that much. It doesn't matter very much because it's procedurally generated. Like, you can't focus too much on a story-based campaign. It's much more about the mechanics, which I might even prefer. I guess what I'm saying, the reason I bring all this up is I might have preferred a custom-made map with more interesting stuff on it. But since you are actually supposed to be playing the game multiple times, I guess it does need to be procedurally generated to some extent, so things will be different every time. We're ready to go, and it looks like I'm already planning something here. I was trying to work out whether my fuel range would jump me across that gap, because at first, with all these lines between towns, you might think, oh, you're supposed to go down the lines, but you can actually fly anywhere. The lines are just there to indicate fast routes between towns, I guess. So you can take any route you want, including over the big empty areas, and that's a good idea. Our adventure begins then, and that means it's time for the radio minigame. You can see how far away we got from the first town, that big white circle. We're the small white circle on the map, before we started going at it with the radio minigame. One thing that really held me back with the radio system was I was trying to rotate the mouse to turn the knob, because you turn them in real life, you know. But it turns out that moving the mouse left to right is the actual control, so by rotating the mouse, you are moving it both left and right, which makes it extra hard to actually pick a number on the dial, which made the radio minigame a bit harder for a decent amount of time. So here's the actual point of it. You get this intel, and we can use this intel, we can look at the map and guess where an enemy ship is going to be, that sort of thing. If we can guess their speed or location or something like that, you might be able to find an enemy transport ship, and capturing transport ships is how you get money, and money is what you use to get fuel and stuff to continue your journey. So you might want to do that. We got about a third to half of the way to our first destination before we're back on the radio. And, well, the point to make about this, and the point that other people were complaining about, and I want to add my complaints to it as well, is just that it takes up a surprising amount of the game time, because you keep stopping to do the radio stuff. It does vary, and there can be journeys where you don't have any radio transmissions, and you can also ignore them or auto-intercept to get a bit of the intel, which perhaps is the intended solution to radio burnout. Here's a fun little thing where if you don't pick the range, the frequency range first, the guy comes over and points at it, but the sort of diagram, the image, is his finger on the button saying, can you press this button? It's like, man, your finger's on the button, why don't you just press it right now? And it raises the question, of course, which is the immersion factor behind this, of why the admiral or the pilot or whoever you're supposed to be also operates the radio. You're supposed to have hundreds of people in your crew. None of them are using the radio. I would love it if somebody handed me the radio intel, because the actual game of selecting the number where it is, it takes a bit of time but it's really easy and boring. So like there's no sort of point in doing this. And more importantly, it just interrupts you from doing something else. Like you're always in the middle of doing something else when the radio thing comes in. And it's not always worth it to actually get the intel anyway. Well, let's put that aside because we've already made enough mistakes in the campaign that we're basically doomed, despite having not done anything. So let's talk through that. We are currently under this alert status because the enemy have noticed we're approaching. The problem is, the fleet composition I took in the beginning doesn't have any fast ships in it, so we can't do a sudden strike. I was planning on just attacking with everything all at once, but because you move too slowly, the enemy will report your position before you kill them. That means we've alerted the enemy right at the start of the game, and their various strike groups around the map will start coming towards us. And because with this fleet setup, that's going to happen at like every single town, they're going to be all over us. And, well, as you'll soon see, what I'm going to be doing is talking about a couple of things in this attempt at the campaign to begin with. And we'll have to start again using the lessons that were very quickly learned as we went along, which is perhaps the way the developers intended the game to be played, of course, so we're going to be playing into that. We'll talk more about that. Here I am doing the first fight, and because we're on easy difficulty, the fights really are way easier than in the tutorial. Like, the enemies groups you face are like a couple of the weakest ships in the game and not like 6 things with like anti-aircraft fire at the same time. It's nice and easy, plus because I only took big ships, the advantage is that we only have powerful things to deploy, but the disadvantages are too large. It's not worth it, I think. I think the meta is that you should take small ships, really, and we'll try that out. At this place there is a little event. There can be a little story event that happens when you reach a town. I think they're sort of random. And this one is that if we stay here for a couple of days to help with a fuel disaster, they'll give us a bunch of free fuel. I thought I'll just do that because the downside it was talking about was that the enemy would detect us if we stayed here for that long. And I thought, well, they've already detected us, so let's just stay here for that long anyway and get the free fuel. And also, I'll buy a bunch more fuel from the store. I was also buying a lot of incendiary rounds. Having seen how powerful they were used against me, I was trying to buy them and use them in battle. It took me a really long time to realize you had to deploy these, or equip these, on your deployed ships. I kind of thought it would just be automatic and you'd press a key on the keyboard to switch ammo type. It doesn't work like that, so I'm going to have all this special ammo and I won't be able to use it for a very long time. We'll try and find the point in this video when I first realize how to equip that ammunition. So, we sit here for a bit, and of course, if we're doing nothing, well, might as well go and do the radio minigame. Still got signals coming in, so we can look for stuff. We can also use the radar to look for stuff, and indeed, there is an enemy something coming towards us. And I wanted to include this clip in the video to show you how simultaneously big-brained and small-brained I was being in this moment. I was kind of enthusiastic about the idea that because the game gives you like a pencil and a ruler to use as tools, that you were supposed to like draw things on the map and do some calculations to get some advantages somehow. I really liked that idea. It felt so like cool and big-brained, as I put it. It felt like an intelligent thing to do. It isn't really, as you'll soon see. What I'm doing is marking the position of this radar contact at a couple of different times, so that I can then use the ruler to measure the distance it travelled during that time. From that, we can know, what can we know? We can know how fast it's going. Is that useful? Potentially. But if you cast your eyes slightly up and right of the radar contact, it actually just tells you how fast it was going. And I did not read that part of the UI, so I was having a great time doing this the hard way. It felt like the clever thing to do. It wasn't. It's also not that useful for me to know how fast this thing is going. Much more useful would be to know what it is. I don't know if you can really work that out just from its radar contact. We can tell from the smoke visible on the screen that it's only a couple of ships in that group. And what I could actually do here is launch the ships that aren't the flagship, the Sevastopol, because the challenge for staying still to help with the fuel situation only actually applies to your flagship. So we can split off the rest of the stuff and go on our way and just keep playing the game, which I realised once I tried to do it to attack this random other ship, or this random other fleet. It just turns around and flies off and also reports our position to the enemy again, so that was not very helpful to us. Again, because our fleet is too slow, we won't be able to intercept any like vulnerable enemy groups or steal their transports or anything, because they can just turn around and leave, and there's just nothing we can do about that. So we continue to be screwed. We do manage to move on without being attacked by the enemy, and I was kind of thinking maybe there's some advantage to right at the start of the campaign, like making a big ruckus like we did just there, so that the enemy will start sending all of their ships down towards the bottom end of the map, and then you just go a different direction and sort of bamboozle them and end up back behind them. I might have stumbled into a good idea there. Well, stop, we've got to do the radio thing, so we do the radio thing for a bit. Probably doesn't tell us anything because the enemy had started encrypting their messages, which we'll look at more later. And we arrive at our next destination, time to fight again. And really I was taking this opportunity to try and get used to aiming. So the idea is that stuff I said earlier, where you take into account your own momentum to kind of guess how the shots will curve as you fire. And you also have to get used to using the tiny sights. So you have that little arrow indicating where your guns are pointing, and you sort of extrapolate that in your brain to like where on the screen your shot's going to end up. It's not that easy to do, but for some reason I sort of gelled with it, as I said earlier, and found it easy enough to get into. At some point I discovered my ship here has a secondary fire mode where it can fire Gatling guns which can destroy enemy missiles. You can even, I learned right at the very end of my Highfleet experience, use them to just destroy all enemy projectiles, which makes the game a decent amount easier. We're going to be playing through most of the game without really knowing about that, although we'll do it by accident plenty of times, so that's good. Once you destroy an enemy fleet, you have this looting decision to make, where these bars are going down on the different things you can loot from the enemy wrecks. And you have to sort of pick an order that gives you the most amount of stuff, and there are also considerations about dangerous things to loot, where you might die if you send your crew to go and loot them, and things that might explode and destroy other loot, but obviously there's no point talking about that, because it's time for the radio minigame. I was interrupted both during the looting process, and just after it finished, I was back on the radio again. So plenty of radio messages coming in. They don't mean anything, and they're not like actually being used in my gameplay, so it really is just an annoyance at the moment. And I think that holds true a decent amount even once I really knew what I was doing with them. We'll see more of them, of course. I then did this very dodgy landing here in the town. As it's saying here, you get repair speed bonuses if you land in these weird little slots in towns. You can also just say don't land, and your ships will be presumed to have gone and landed somewhere else, like outside of the town where there's no difficulty for landing. And you just don't get any bonuses. And in many cases, it's kind of better to do that, because you'll take so much damage badly doing the landing, as I do, that maybe it's not worth the repair bonuses. So we're repairing up here at this town. One thing I didn't realise is that on the repair menu, if you mouse down towards the bottom of the screen, it turns it into the ship customization menu. So that's another thing that took me a while to sort of rediscover in the game, how to open up the ship customization menu, because it's not like an explicit menu, it's like a part that is off the screen of a different menu. Something, UX comment being made there. So we sit around here repairing up. We've got some intel coming in because this town has an enemy intel station. So we can use this intel thing towards the right to reveal the location of other enemy fleets. The only problem I had with this is that it reveals the location of things that are like really far away sometimes as well. So you can ask for the intel on where the enemy strike groups are, but it might just tell you they've got like a carrier strike group at the other end of the map doing nothing because it wasn't alerted to you, and that might not be useful. I guess what I want to know is like, where are all the things near me? Like, I'd just like to have the entire map revealed in a radius or something like that. Well, no point talking about that because it's time for the radio minigame. Another signal coming in, just going to be something encrypted, we can't use it. I'm doing this anyway. What I should do here is either ignore it or just auto-intercept, because I don't have the decryption keys for the enemy's radio transmissions, so getting them doesn't help me at all. Even if I eventually decode them, all I'll have then is some really out-of-date intel from earlier in the campaign, which probably won't be of any use. So I'm shooting myself in the foot here. I don't really need to decode these radio transmissions or need to intercept them. I just didn't know that, so I felt obliged to do them all, and it was a bit miserable. It just sort of stacks up over time the more times you have to do it. I think the actual solution, if you're not going to change the game design anyway, is just make it clearer that you could just straight up ignore them, which I think is the reality. You could just ignore all of the radio stuff for most of the campaign and still play the game basically exactly the same, but it would be significantly faster and more just like single-tracked and continuous because you don't stop to do the radio stuff. Now what's happening here? We are being hunted down by a enemy strike group. I'm cutting forwards here. I want to just sort of jump through the rest of this failed initial attempt at the campaign and show you a couple more lessons learned along the way. I flew somewhere, and one of the strike groups that was supposedly being alerted to my position the whole time actually did show up. So fighting a strike group is a hard battle. It's almost as hard as the tutorial battles, or about as hard, although it's difficult to actually compare it because this time we're using the Sevastopol, which is extremely powerful in combat. So while they have come at us with a bunch of stuff, I'm gradually just blowing them out of the sky, and you might note that I'm not using the Sevastopol very well. The Sevastopol has this automatic, super powerful cannon. I thought it was semi-automatic, so I was just doing single clicks on the mouse to fire like 1 or 2 shots at a time. You can just hold it down and use it as an automatic weapon. It's just the most powerful thing in the game, essentially. It's absolutely out of control how powerful it is. But I didn't know that, so I had some difficulties with this strike group, and they eventually ground us down. The Sevastopol is a nice little ship. It fits into something I occasionally mention on this channel, the idea that in a strategy game you should always have one overpowered thing, one overpowered tool in your arsenal, which you can just whip out to do something. If you ever definitely need to like guarantee a result on something, you use the overpowered thing, and what that is depends on the game, and in this game it is the Sevastopol. If the enemy are coming at you with a lot of stuff, you just decide to use this ship instead of the rest of your fleet, and it will just destroy the enemy pretty easily. Here's me retrying that battle, and somewhere along the way I realised we can automatic fire the main guns and we start just blowing everything up. But we ourselves are getting pretty blown up, because the downside to using the Sevastopol is that it can't dodge enemy attacks, so you just have to get hit by absolutely everything. You're going to be very on fire. We can't even see ourselves. Somewhere our unit is on the screen, but it's being hit by so many things simultaneously, and we're so on fire. Well, it's hard to deal with it. Essentially, the Sevastopol can take a lot of punishment, so it's not that bad. It's just that it costs you tons of money to repair it, and you might want to save it for a later battle. Which is, by the way, to continue on a rant from my Star Sector video recently, a better way of punishing the player for using a powerful unit. Don't make them pay to use it, make them pay to repair it if it takes damage in battle. That makes more sense to me. So here's me on the repair menu. We've discovered the thing that brings up the customization system as well, although as I said, we're not really going to be using it because usually there aren't enough parts available to do anything significant. All I really need to do is try to repair the ship and get it back into good condition. Because this takes such a long time with the Sevastopol, you're likely to just be attacked again by more enemies. I think there actually are a finite number of groups the enemy forces in general will send at you. So if you're feeling very confident, I think you could sit somewhere and just let the enemy come to you and keep killing all of them. It's not that easy, as we'll see, but there's some idea that you might actually want to try and let the enemy find you so you could just straight up kill them and not have to worry about them too much. Well, it got to the point when I fought a couple of strike groups, and we started to run out of money because I kept repairing the Sevastopol, which takes loads of time as well, and we had this entertaining situation where I needed to land the Sevastopol to speed up the repairs, but it had taken so much damage in battle that it doesn't have enough engine power to really be landed. You get into this awkward situation where ships exist on the campaign map in an abstract kind of way. If they actually don't have enough engines to stay in the sky, they still exist until it comes to you trying to land them, and then you'll find that you just can't do it. And well, things went very wrong here. We actually destroyed another ship while landing, by sort of landing on top of it, so that went very well. Another happy landing. We can keep saying that in this game, which is quite nice. Well, I ended up fighting again by the looks of things, and the only thing I wanted to say, and the only reason this clip is in this video, is look at how good it looks. I absolutely love when you fight at night and the explosions light up the entire environment for a bit and everything flashes white. Super cool. The secondary fire there is doing a lot of work as I try to take out enemy missiles, and as I said, you can actually just fire straight into the oncoming bands of enemy fire and it will take up some of their shells as well, but I was only doing it by accident at this stage. I was mainly trying to focus on the missiles. The main point being though that we got into a whole bunch of fights without making that much progress in the game, and I'd run out of money, like I'd spent all of my parts and time and just ability to do anything in the campaign, and the enemy was still coming at me with stuff, and eventually we just got ground into a pulp, and I thought, well, that's got to be the end of that. We aren't actually out of the fight because you can just retry battles, so I could just keep fighting whatever that fight was until it went really well. Might take years of in-game training to be able to get that good at the game to win that fight. Instead, you can just be like, no, I'll just say game over. Interestingly though, it hits you with this little mechanic, which was so unexpected, but again, it's like flashing on the roguelike radar, where it gives you a score, and then it says, you get this as bonus money the next time you play the campaign. And I was sort of like, okay, well, thanks, but no. So that means you want me to like grind to get a good score so that I can do the campaign again with more money. I just really wanted it to be like playable from the beginning. I wanted to be able to do it the first time around or with the initial set of resources only. I didn't want it to expect me to try and fail, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, we can't say that's a terrible game design decision or anything like that. I just really didn't want it, and that's all I can really say about it. Like, I wanted to have a continuous playthrough. I wanted to, in some way, like, just make it work and, like, have some clever things happen where I'd, like, find ways to get out of all the difficult situations. But I think because the game is very full on, it hits you with everything right away. It's just very difficult to actually do that. And that's probably like the big, like large-scale change I might suggest to the game, where we would have some kind of campaign that is in between the tutorial campaign and the full campaign, like a campaign where it has most of the mechanics but not all of them, where you learn to use certain things, and that means when you hit the main campaign and you're using everything, you'd have enough confidence and enough skill, enough game knowledge to make use and get more fun out of the challenges that's being presented to you, I think anyway. So basically we just learned everything the hard way instead. We learned how not to play the game, and as I said, I'm pretty sure that's what they wanted you to do, to some extent, or I guess they wanted you to go to the walkthrough and get it right first time that way, but I'm not very interested in that sort of approach. Well, we've got our extra money now, so I guess we'll just start the game again. But this time, we're going to be able to make some informed decisions about what ships to take in the beginning, because now we know what to expect and what things are going to be strategically useful to us. Perhaps the biggest point to make right now is that what didn't happen was I, like, closed the game and came back to play the campaign again a different time. I started playing it again in the same session, and that's a kind of rarity. Like, normally, if I'd been having a really miserable time, I would have stopped and then forced myself to play it again another time. The fact that I actually kept playing shows that I liked the game in some way, despite all of my complaints. I was willing to start it again, and because I'm sort of stingy and I'm often unwilling to do that, I think that's something in Highfleet's favour right there, even if I am trying also to get across that I think this initial experience wasn't as good as I thought it could be, and I think it remains a problem. It's like I can't love the game because of all this, but I can like it. Like, I had too much of a negative experience with it to say, like, yeah, that was great. But it's another case where I think it's not that far off. I think delivering the same content in a slightly different way, and probably a slower way as well, would get a lot of people on the I love it bandwagon, because the material to get people there, the bandwagon itself, is all there, and that's the hard part already done. What am I doing here? I was playing with the settings. I was trying to make it so that I could tell what was going on in combat a bit more. There's various stuff you can do. I'm going to go with a mixed bag here. You can turn off the glitches so that your like UI stuff jumps around a bit less, because I was finding that pretty annoying actually. The other thing you could do is turn down the graphics settings, which makes the graphics much like clearer and neater, which again just helps you see what's going on. But I decided not to do that and keep all of the like water on the screen and the bloom, which does obscure what you're looking at, because I felt like it's kind of supposed to be like that. So I'm guessing I'm keeping that as a challenge. But yes, there is a sort of secret easy mode. Turn the graphics down and like you can just see more in battles, which will probably improve your performance a decent amount, especially in the beginning. So anyway, let's head out and do this campaign again. Devin from the future here. As you can perhaps tell, I'm going to put the rest of the campaign in a different video. I'm going to finish this video off with a few post-introductory notes, I suppose. So this can be our part 1 of the campaign, where I got to grips with the tutorial and failing, and we'll look at a full campaign in the next video. What I'm doing right here is playing with the ship designer. I had this idea in mind that doesn't work, so let's just discuss it not working. What I wanted to do was take the Sevastopol, which you have to take on your campaign, and scale it down, because I thought I suck too hard to care about like trying to get guided missiles to work or caring very much about anti-aircraft missiles or something. I thought, can I get a version of this ship that's way cheaper to repair and doesn't have loads of exposed parts all over it, but has the same amount of firepower? That's what I was thinking. And I end up creating this thing, the Lesvastopol, which has the same guns and engines but is lighter and doesn't have loads of like radars and things that are expensive just outside of the armor like the Sevastopol has. So this thing can take more punishment because it's mainly going to be taking hits onto the armor. But we don't sacrifice anything in terms of ability to punish the enemy along the way, except not using the guided missiles, which, for reasons I'll probably discuss in the next campaign, doesn't matter too much to me. Basically, I didn't find that many of them, so not having loads of guided missile launchers isn't that much of a problem, I don't think. Well anyway, it's working pretty well, and obviously you can see the ship builder comes with this simulator, which I thought was a really good feature that might even be worth just bringing out onto the main menu, because I probably would have used this before playing the main campaign. You can just simulate battles against enemy parties, and, well, after failing with the Sevastopol thing, we'll talk more about that in a second, I came and just started using the other ships. Because this is basically a training mode, it's basically the tutorial, it's hidden in a sub-menu of the ship builder. You can open up this thing and just start using all of the ships in the game to get used to them and get used to the controls and stuff. And it worked out. I've played this a bunch of times, not only to get good, but because I liked the battle system. I liked looking at it at least, and what I didn't like is how hard it was, so the ability to get a bit better at it was nice as well. So we did some training there, and throughout the training process I decided upon what I'm going to do with the ship builder, because long story short, you can't do anything about the Sevastopol. You have to take it unless you do some shenanigans. Doesn't matter too much. So that original design isn't going to be of any use to me, but I can make a new design by editing one of the pre-built ships. These are the ships you have the option to take with you at the beginning of the campaign. You can edit those designs and your edits will come through into the campaign. So what I did was take a cruiser, the Gepard, and remove again some of its extraneous parts so it's more covered in armor and loses some of its capabilities. It now can't fire missiles, it doesn't have a fire control radar, but what it does have are some guns and a ball of armor. So it's good at getting shot and shooting at the enemies, so for basic playstyles, that's all we're gonna need. The other thing I've changed, you might have noted, is in the options you could add this line that sticks out of your ship in the direction your guns are facing, which just makes aiming easier. I feel like it just should have been like this. I really think this should be a mechanic actually rather than an option. Like the line sticking out of your ship should represent how good your sights are, so accurate guns just get a longer line so that you actually become more accurate with them. Like that's the accuracy point of improvement rather than like the gun's stats having higher accuracy. Well anyway, I used that design for a bit in the testing mode, and because it only has light guns, I knew I needed some sort of slightly better version of it. So I also made a secondary version where we've taken out the 4 chain guns that the original Gepard had, and swapped it for 2 cannons. This gives us the ability to pierce armor a bit better and deal with larger targets, but this design is going to be really player skill dependent, as you can see here. Because the ship's kind of small to maintain its maneuverability, it only has enough ammo capacity to fire 2 shots at a time. So you better hit with them basically. It's time for some geometry on the fly. Using that long line's going to make it a bit easier, but you can see I was still having difficulties. So with this ship, we'll get more power than the original Geparder, as I called it, but you better actually hit the enemy at some point or it's just not going to do anything at all. So we've got those 2 new designs. We're going to take both of them into the campaign. And on the campaign setup menu, they will just be added as options for you to take. It calculates their rough cost and it's about the same as it turns out as the original Gepard, so that's fine. And we'll probably want to take something else. So this is where we'll stop. The thing you could do that I mentioned by the way is you can go in the game files and edit it so that any ship counts as the flagship, and that allows you to not take the Sevastopol. So I could take my Lesvastopol if I did some hacks in the background, but I decided not to do that to keep the general vanilla feel going. Same deal with me not turning off the water effects on the screen, that sort of thing. We're going to keep the original challenge. They intended for you to take the Sevastopol even if you don't really want it, as I don't, so we'll just deal with that. But at least we will have my custom designs, and perhaps more importantly than the custom designs, because I just played like 10 battles in the simulator, I'm now better at the game than I was before. And again, I think the possibility of throwing that simulator at the beginning of the game, like even before the tutorial, might be interesting, because even the tutorial combat was too hard, I thought, and being able to just do some consequence-free battles first might make that a bit easier. So perhaps the game should direct people to try it first and be like, by the way, you actually need to be good at this game at least a little bit to play the tutorial, like we expect something from you, so just try this first to see if you have any skill. Anyway, we'll be going into the full campaign in the next video. It's going to be on easy difficulty because I suck and I want to save, and we'll just see what happens. I'll do a full gameplay commentary on that. So thanks for watching this introductory video to Highfleet with basically all the thoughts I had as I played it for the first time, and how things went wrong when I played it for the first time, but they didn't go wrong in such a way that I thought it's not worth trying again. So that's something very much in the game's favour. We're going to come back in and try to make it work using some of my own newly gained skills and ingenuity, and that's the fun thing. That's the nice way to approach a hard game. If that is a hard game that always has like an option, you always feel like there's something you haven't tried yet. You don't just feel like you just have to quote-unquote get good and just go through the misery of not enjoying it until you somehow get good at it. I always felt like there's something more to try in Highfleet because it does have some depth to it. So we're going to try custom ships, knowing what we're doing a little bit, and doing the campaign strategy slightly differently as well based on what we learned the first time around. We'll talk about all of that in the next video, so if you want to see more Highfleet, I will see you there.